You're listening to EdTech Heroes, a podcast that looks at how teachers in today's classrooms can use technology to improve student learning. In each episode, a hero in the world of education will share their story and discuss how innovation can influence the minds of the next generation. Let's jump in.
Hey y'all, and welcome to EdTech Heroes. I am your host, Nef, and today I'm excited to be joined by Toni Rose Deanon for the second part of our discussion with the Modern Classrooms Project. If you didn't check it out, last episode, we got an opportunity to chat with Sarah Moon to learn even more about MCP. So Toni's here this time. She has spent 10 years as a middle school English teacher and is currently the Community Engagement Manager for the Modern Classrooms Project. Toni Rose, welcome to EdTech Heroes.
Hi, Nef. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you here. So last time we got an opportunity to talk with Sarah, I said that sort of at the top. Can you tell us a little bit about the mentorship program and how you all are equipping mentors to build modern classrooms on their own?
Oh, yeah. So our mentorship program, actually, we have our mentees. We have our virtually mentorship program that's happening during the school year, as well as Summer Institute. And so during the summer, it's about a 5-week program. And then during the school year, it's about 10 to 12-week program. And so we have 5 different lessons that our mentees or teachers who really want to implement the model kind of go through. And they're paired up with a mentor who has implemented the model for a year or so, right? And so if you think about, Nef, have you heard of the dating app OkCupid?
I have.
Okay, great. So we kind of do our pairing that way, honestly. And so we figure out the grade level, the content, as well as like what kind of LMS our mentees are using. And we pair them up with a mentor who is very similar to those experiences. And so it's kind of how we pair it up. And so it just kind of works out that our mentees have our mentors to kind of be thought partners to go through the different courses or the lessons that they're going through. And just our mentors are able to provide the feedback right away in live time. And so our mentors give feedback within like 2 days, and you can have like one-on-one calls with your mentors just to kind of continue that conversation, right? Because sometimes when you're implementing a brand new instructional model, especially if you're alone at your school, you really want to have that conversation with someone to see how you're implementing it, or even just get some feedback just to know that like, okay, you're kind of on the right quote unquote right pathway of implementing this model. There's no one right way. There's multiple right ways. But just to have that thought partner and to have that conversation and know that a teacher is right there helping you through implementing this model is actually super, super exciting and impactful, right? And so we try to create a learning environment where it's self-paced. So our mentees / our teachers are able to go through this course in their own pace. They have that time period as well. And then we have some touch points as well. So it's kind of like either a presentation or a webinar or even just a brainstorming meetup where teachers can really talk about like, hey, I'm really stuck on this self-paced thing, this pacing tracker. What are y'all doing? How are you navigating these challenges? And so just continuing to have that community as well as just like thought partners to brainstorm any like cool things or challenging things that are happening. And so we're hoping that with the mentorship program, we are giving this support, and Modern Classroom is well known for like the support that we give as well. Like we give like feedback right away. We're pretty accessible on our social media as well as email. Like you'll always have someone kind of just helping you and supporting you with however and whatever you need. And so it's a really cool mentorship program so that you're not, again, doing this by yourself, but you have some kind of guidance and some community kind of rooting you on. So
Yeah, totally. You got some folks to cheer, be your own personal fan club. And I particularly like the aspect of pairing folks with other individuals who have similar experiences, whether that's using the same technology platform, teaching the same grade, teaching in a similar school. I think so often we engage in professional development and it's like, yeah, this is all fine and good, but like this person doesn't quite know what I'm dealing with, right? They don't know about my kids. And of course, that's always going to be true. We all have very unique ways in which we engage with the students in front of us. But at least if there are some of those similarities, we can talk about best practices from a place of both of us coming from similar lived experiences. So I really like that y'all are doing it that way.
Yeah, I mean, and we do try to do that as much as we can. There was one time where I was paired with a dance teacher. Now, mind you, I taught English, middle school English. And so I knew nothing about dance instruction, but it was just so beautiful because she was learning the model from me and I was learning her content from her. And she was really showcasing and portraying like what she did in the classroom, and I was able to follow through because of the model, right? Like we created videos so I could see the skills that she was teaching her students, as well as how self-pacing and mastery-based learning would happen in her classes. And I was like, this is a dance class. This is so cool. But I definitely had the imposter syndrome of like, wait a minute, what am I doing?
Totally. Okay, two questions. One, are you a better dancer because of that? And two, for the people who are watching this podcast in video form, can you show us one of the things that you learned?
Uh, so terminology wise, like I was able to look at all the GIFs that she had created, like different, like choreography, right? Of just being able to like, hey, you want to create something that brings out emotions. And so she had her students, like there was a theme and students had to create a movement for the theme. And I thought that that was so dope. As far as dance moves, I don't know, Nef. I feel like I have to practice that.
All right, we're going to have you on in like a year or two from now, and we're going to check back in to see how these dance moves are going. But like, actually, what's kind of crazy though is that like sort of assignment around create a dance move to portray an emotion. Like, I was an English teacher too. Like, I could see that going in my class, right? It's like, pretend that you are this character and like, how would they dance when X or Y thing happened to them? So it's kind of interesting that those curriculums can be so different, but you might be able to get some inspiration from talking to that person too.
Oh my gosh, definitely. Like I always tell my mentees, the teachers that I work with, like if I could go back in the classroom tomorrow, I would definitely steal the ideas that they created for me to just be like, oh, I'm going to try this and I'm going to try that. And I think the beauty of this dance instructor as well was the fact that she modeled the expectations for her students. So you could see her dancing as well. So like she's modeling it as well as like showing her students like, no, I'm going to do what I'm telling you to do. You know what I'm saying? So like, and I think that that's really important that like as educators, when we give students a task, it's really good for us to also do them just so that we know what the misconceptions and like where they're going to get stuck at. Right. And so I just loved, and then she invited her kids in as well. So it was like, covering so many things, right? Like students could see like, oh, they were introduced to her daughters, they were introduced to her home and her dance moves. Like it was beautiful. It was so beautiful. I loved it.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, especially for something like dance that I consider to be a very vulnerable act. And maybe that's because I'm a terrible dancer. But I think like being able to see her engage in that would have made me 10 times more comfortable. So what an A+ move. I like it.
Yeah. I like to think I'm a really good dancer, Nef, but I just am not ready to show
I was
this
going to say,
dance move to anyone.
but you won't show us. So at this point, as far as I'm concerned, as far as everybody who listens to this podcast is concerned, you're a terrible dancer too. You're just as bad as I am.
I guess I'm okay with that. I could leave it at that. That's fine.
All right. That's what it's going to be. You heard it here first. So, switching gears a little bit, I know that you have talked pretty extensively about using video for social emotional learning. And that's something that we've talked about a little bit on this podcast, but it's something that you can always talk about more. So, I want to talk about one, why is SEL so important? And two, how is prioritizing that in our classroom sort of key to making sure that students feel represented, that they feel valued, and they have this sense of belonging?
Yeah, and that's just such a great question as well, right? I'm so happy that there's a main priority or a main focus on social emotional learning now. I feel like as a school environment, that is really important for us to kind of focus on because our students really do try to show up as authentically and as genuinely as themselves in the classroom, right? And so I know as a middle school teacher for 10 years, if my student has something that happened outside of the classroom, they're not going to be able to learn in the classroom. So whatever it is that they're they're going through at home with their friends, with their, partners or crushes or whatever, they're bringing all of that in, right? And there are times where like I have students who didn't know how to articulate their feelings. Right. And so being able to articulate their feelings as well as being aware of like, oh, these feelings are coming up for me. It's really good to have those words to be able to articulate that. And so educators aren't assuming that like so and so is just blank, right? Or whatever it is that they're assuming. But it's also like, no, actually, like this student is going through it. And so we need to provide that space for them to be okay as they go through it and also be able to pick up whenever they need to pick up, because we can't expect for our students to show up ready and prepared every single day. Like, wouldn't that be nice? That would be amazing. But even now as an adult, I can't show up every single day happy and ready and prepared to do whatever it is that I need to do because of whatever's happening outside of what I need to do, right? And so when it comes to social emotional learning, like even with videos, right? I've worked with students with 504s, with IEPs, as well as emergent multilinguals, right? And this is something that you and I have talked about too, is like, I'm not a native speaker of English. And so I really needed to be able to have people kind of slow down when they're talking to me when I first moved to the US, and also just have patience, right? Because I also had like a really thick accent when I moved here. And so with videos, and that was me as a student, right? And so when I became an educator, because I knew the impact and the power of educators in students' lives, I was like, I want to be able to create lessons and content that's much more accessible for every single learner, right? And so when I first started implementing Modern Classroom, I just saw my students' confidence really increase because they didn't feel the need to interrupt the lesson, right? They didn't need to feel dumb because they didn't understand, quote unquote, right? Like because they didn't understand what it was that I was talking about. But with videos, my students were able to pause, process. They could replay it if they were aware that they'd spaced out, because it happens. People space out. And so they're like, oh, snap, I didn't actually understand that. Let me replay it. They can slow down the learning, and they can also quicken their learning depending on what type of learner we have. And so now you're creating this space where they're like, okay, I have this video, this lesson that I can watch in my own pace when I'm ready to watch it. And I think I'm ready. I'm going to try to watch it. Hold on. Wait a minute. I need a moment to just like process, or even just take another 2-3 more minutes to just get myself together, right? And so with videos, we're teaching our students how to manage their emotions, how to manage their time, and really how to be aware of their surroundings and aware of how they're learning. I also told my students, with videos, you're more than welcome to take notes however you would like, right? And so my students would sometimes sketch things out with sketch notes, or they would do bulleted points, or they would just write down keywords that they thought were important. And especially with my students who are emergent multilinguals, if it's a word that they have no idea, they can literally pause, go like search and figure out what this word means, and then go back to their video just so that they have a better understanding. So now you're creating a self-directed learner. So they're not actually depending on the educator to tell them exactly what something is. They can now figure that out on their own. And so these are all skills that just kind of come along with the power of video, right? And when we start thinking about like, how can video help our learners feel more represented and be valued and like they belong? When you think about accessibility, especially like with videos, you have your captions, you have like fonts that you're super intentional with, as well as coloring and emojis that you're using. When they see that a lot of their classmates are using the same features and accessibility like features that they're using, it becomes normal, like, right? So it's like normalized. And this is something that I tell educators that I work with all the time, is that when you have accommodations, make it available for all students. Because even as like an avid reader myself, I love for things to be read aloud to me. I think, depending on my mood, like, yes, I love audiobooks. I will sit there and listen and still follow along. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But so I have the accessibility and accommodations all available to all of my students. It's not just for that particular student, because then I don't want to isolate or like make those students feel some type of way that they're getting quote unquote special treatment, right? Like, and that's not what we want. I mean, especially middle schoolers, right? They like notice every single thing. And so you have to be like really mindful of that. And so when it comes to like, they feel valued because now they know like, oh, there's this feature that I really need because of whatever it is that I may or may not have. I can access it. I can turn that on. I can turn it off. But there's not an expectation that just because you're this type of learner, you need this type of accommodation. Like we don't want that. But it's like literally opened up to everyone. And so when they feel comfortable, when they feel brave enough to be able to access all of this, right, and advocate for themselves, now they feel better in that classroom environment. They feel like, oh, I'm valued because my teacher knows that any of these things can happen for anybody. And so now it's just kind of like an accessibility and like accommodations for all, right, and not just for some. And our students feel more comfortable really becoming the learners that they are, that they've always been. And they're not trying to fit in that norm, right? I really hate that norm. Not my favorite. And so I'm always like, let's celebrate the way that you learn, however it is that you may learn. And with the videos, it really just does allow for students to access the information however they need. But then, like, I know you and I are going to talk about how students can use videos themselves to create a more like inclusive and like exciting classroom. And so I can just talk about video all day.
I like it. You're on the right podcast. But I want to call out a couple of the things that you said, because I think sometimes for those of us who have been creating videos for a while, we think of them as commonplace and maybe just best practices. But things like having captions available and being able to have students be able to pause those videos, play them, and engage with them in whatever way is going to make the most sense are really SEL best practices, even if we might not be thinking of them as such. So it's really cool that we can give that to all of our students and allow every single one of them to benefit from some of those video features that might exist. But yeah, like you started to broach the topic. So like, let's talk about it. Like, how do videos kind of allow students to sort of be in this creative space and allow them to feel represented and all that jazz? Let's talk about that. Like, what are videos to students?
Yeah, so I believe this is my 9th year of teaching. So I've always incorporated technology in my classroom, but I've never thought of like my students actually creating videos. I don't know why, but like that just never dawned on me until like my 9th year of teaching, which I was like, what in the world? And there was like that pressure of presentations, right? Like every student has to do a presentation live in front of their peers. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I hated as a teacher sitting there and listening to every single presentation and in real time. Because again, like we're expecting our students to all be phenomenal public speakers, and that's not the case, right? And so sometimes our students will just kind of like mumble, or there's just a really weird pause, and time is just ticking like, oh my goodness, like come on, like can we go? And so I found that to be kind of a barrier, especially for students who are not as outgoing as others, right? And so when I started implementing videos, and me not just creating the videos, but actually my students creating it, I was like, you know what? I want to see how this goes and how it works. And so I actually introduced Screencastify to my 6th graders. And I said, okay, you have this class time to play around with Screencastify. Have fun with it, figure it out on your own. And of course, our students were able to like figure it out on their own, which was so beautiful. And then I said, we have a group project, and every group is going to create a 3-minute video presenting on whatever it is that you did your research on, right? And when I tell you, it was so much more exciting for me to watch, right? And like for our students to really put it all together, because again, our students are able to, do all the cool things. Like they could have done editing, they had transitions, they had GIFs and like things popping up, and like the students really got into it. And just the excitement was so great. And you knew for a fact that each group literally just had 3 minutes to go over everything that they need to go over. And so it taught my students to plan in advance, right? It taught them to figure out who's going to do what with the video and who's going to say what, and what their roles are. And then it also allows for students who are a little bit more advanced with technology and video editing tools to really shine. Like, I had the spectrum of like really basic videos to like videos that I was like, wait a minute, how cool. This is so cool. Like, it really is such a great way for students to just shine, right? So like I had students who who just had like the slides and they were just
Mhm.
showcasing it and like, doing the annotations and, all of that good stuff. But then I had students who were like, you know what, I want to act this out. So then they were able to act it out and they were able to put, and it was just so creative. And I know time and time again, I was like, how did you do that? Can you teach me how to do that? And so it was a way for them to really just own their learning and also express what they learned however they wanted to express it. And there wasn't a way that, they didn't have to stand in front of the class anymore, be
Mhm.
uncomfortable and, like stumble with their words or get embarrassed or like they're just not in that spotlight. And that's okay, right? Like we don't have to have that spotlight on students all the time. And so I still, hands down, it was my favorite activity because my students were able to just shine and they were able
Mhm.
to be so excited about what they wanted to show. And for students who are like, I don't want my face in it, I'm like, cool, you don't have to have your face in it. That's okay. Right. And so
Mhm.
let's figure out what works for you as long as you're covering like these base guidelines of like, this is a topic that you're researching. This is what I want you to like share with your group. And then everything else is really up to you. And so it was just really empowering for my students and also fascinating for me as an educator because I learned so much from them. And then I was also really excited to watch the videos that they created. And we still did a whole group of like, okay, group one, go show your video. Right.
Mhm.
And so they shared their video. They have 3 minutes to share. We watched it and then 2 minutes of feedback time. So our time was so efficient. It was so effective. And I just really loved the whole flow of it. And so I
Mhm.
mean, I know you've had conversations already of like, hey, instead of like real live like presentations, create videos to share that knowledge with other people and then also just continue to have that conversation of like, hey, how did you do that? Or I really like this. Or maybe you could have, talked more about this. And I don't know. It's just so cool to see our students be so creative because I always say like I'm not creative. And then like
Mhm.
I come up with ideas like this and I'm like, look at me. I actually am creative.
No, that's so cool. And I think it's important to admit that that experience of students going up and presenting at the front of the class is actually a pretty horrid experience for the teacher too. I don't know about you, but for me, it was like I'm half trying to pay attention. I'm trying to make sure that Richard over in the corner is not talking or making funny faces or whatever it is. And I'll also say that like I don't hear the best sometimes. So being able to like pause and replay and all of that in terms of why we think videos are great for students are also some of the ways where they become great for educators when we go in and try to grade fairly and try to put that against a rubric. So I'm really glad that you sort of talked about that perspective, not only what it is for students, but what it is for teachers in terms of making that assignment more accessible for us.
Yeah, and I definitely love the video aspect of it too, because then I could share it with my admin, with the school leaders, and be
Mm,
like,
mhm.
yo, look at this group, look at what they created. And they didn't need to be in the space to witness it, that I could actually take that learning and that experience and go somewhere else with it, right? Because like our school
Very
leaders are
cool.
so
Yeah.
busy and they're not able to be in your classroom at all times, of, like when cool things are happening. And so the videos itself, and I did nothing. Like my students literally did it all, and I just shared a link. And it was
Yeah,
so
yeah,
great
yeah.
because it expanded it, right? And I was able to also share it with families, with caregivers, so they
Mhm.
can see like, wow, this is a really cool thing that my child did. So again, it just kind of expands where our learning happens. It's no longer in the four walls of our classroom, but it actually is something that they can take away and show like, hey, like look at this cool thing that I did in English today. And I love that part of videos as well.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I really, really like that in terms of allowing folks to be able to share it. And I think it makes you a little bit more proud of it when you're a student, right? There's like this like transactional relationship a lot of times of like, I created this, I handed it to my teacher handed it back to me, and then I handed it to the trash can, and that's about it for it, right? But it's going a little bit beyond that, which is so, so cool. So
Oh my gosh. It's so true though. It really does go in the trash. And it's like we don't want that. We actually want like a genuine audience, right? Of like the cool things. I mean, students, anybody really would like for their work to be showcased and to just be something that you're so proud of, right? And you're absolutely right about the transactional piece. And that's just so sad. It happens time and time again, more times than I would like to admit.
yeah, for sure. So I know that you talked a little bit about the length of video and video best practices, and you'll have lots of guidelines and best practices at MCP. And I know that one of the things that you all espouse is that most videos that a teacher creates can be pretty short. They should be like punchy to the point. But there's also value in having a little bit more breathing room and having slightly longer videos. What is sort of the difference there? How does a teacher decide, like, hey, this needs to be a 5-minute video or a 2-minute video, and maybe what requires a little bit more explanation and is worthy of asking students to take an extra minute or two to engage in that?
Yeah, and Neff, I was thinking about this for the longest time because in my head I was like, longer videos, ew.
No, I mean, you're welcome to disagree with me. What are you thinking? Lay it on the line right here on this podcast.
I again, like as an adult, I like am done after 5 minutes, right? Like it has to be
Yeah.
something that's really quick. I mean, especially we have TikTok now where micro learning is happening in less than 90 seconds. And so it has to be really quick. And it's kind of like how it is now in this world, unfortunately. And so I was thinking about this and reflecting back on like some of my mentees' longer videos. It really does make sense to have a longer video when that skill is a much more challenging skill, right? Like if an educator knew like, oh, this is going to be really difficult for my students to understand, like right there and then, I really have to scaffold it so that my students understand exactly what I'm talking about. So I know for me in 6th grade, theme was really difficult for students because, transitioning from what they learned in elementary school to now, it's not just one word, it's actually like a whole sentence of what a theme is, right? And so, and again, that's like something that English teachers can go back and forth with what a theme is. And so I just knew my students really struggled with theme. And so our theme videos were a little bit longer than the rest of our skill videos because we knew that this was going to be a challenging thing. It's something that like students really had to come up with, right, based on what they read, and they needed a lot more practice. And so when I think about longer videos, it's either when you know that a skill is going to be a little bit challenging and it's a really complex skill, a longer video is definitely a-okay and needed. Another thing that I've seen around too is that for science teachers who have lab videos, right, like if you're going over all the materials that you need for lab, and like talking about the safety rules and the precautions and like what could happen if you messed up, like that is a little bit longer as well, right? I mean, you could definitely, and the way that this could work too is that, you may have a longer video and you can still get your students to pause at like 5 minutes and like process what was just being, said in those videos and then continue that learning, right? And so because I've also worked with a lot of AP teachers in high school who are like, we have all of these skills that we have to teach. Like it has to be longer than like 5 or 7 minutes. So their videos are, 15 minutes or so because they're talking about the text that they're reading. They're talking about the skill that they need. And then there's readings, there's writing, there's like different components of an assignment. And so that could take a lot more time as well. And I think like another thing that I saw was a teacher who went over their syllabus. So this is for a 12th grade class, right? They went over their syllabus and that syllabus was a little long, but he wanted to make sure that he pinpointed every single thing that needed to be pinpointed on that syllabus. And that syllabus video was about 12 minutes long, right? And there was even one that was like 22 minutes. And it was literally just him going over the syllabus with his students because, sometimes we create these like beautiful syllabi and then like they don't get read. Honestly.
Do they meet the trash too?
Yeah. I'm sure they do. Like, cause it's just like, okay, there's this thing that you are giving me, but you're not going over it with me. And I think one of like the better practices that we want to make sure that we do as educators is that when we give something to students, that we actually use it, that we actually go over it, that we actually model whatever it is that we want on that document, right? We can't just, here you go, here's a 2, 3, 4, 5 page thing, have fun, good luck, right? And so going through it, a directional video could be really long as well when you're talking about labs or even just like anything that you want to showcase. We had a band instructor who also talked about rhythm and showed how rhythm worked and practicing it with students over and over again with different songs and different rhythms. And so that could also take a little longer as well. And I always tell the mentees as well, like there was one where I got like maybe a 30-minute video and I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And then I realized like, no, like these are actually really important skills that need to be all in the same video. But again, like being intentional with like, just pause. Make sure that there's a pause somewhere there, just so that they're not just listening to it, but not paying attention to it, if that makes sense.
Totally, totally. And I guess I like want to go back to you sort of talking about like TikTok and all of that. And I feel like there's so much that you can learn from creators and storytellers on TikTok. And one of the things that sort of stands out to me is a lot of times you'll have these whole like anthologies or like story times that span 6 different TikToks. But the first one you see is like 10 or 15 seconds is just like, hey, this really crazy thing happened to me, right? And at that point, you're invested in the story and you're like, all right, I'm down for part 2. And you watch part 2 and you're like, give me part 3. And you've been sitting there for 15 or 20 minutes, but you're so engaged in the story. So I think when you talk about sort of that scaffolding and we think about the level of complexity perhaps necessitating a longer video, theoretically, we might have already hooked our students with that really short video and they're ready for part 2. They're ready for part 3 that gets a little bit longer. So I love that idea of like how much scaffolding give us an opportunity to increase the length of the video. I also want to throw out there a little bit of a plug, but Screencastify recently changed our pricing model. And what that means is that you get to create videos up to 30 minutes completely for free. So that used to be something people were like, but hey, like I got something at the 5 minute and 30-second mark. And they were like, what do you do with Screencastify? So I'm glad that that's a change for folks who might want to get a little bit farther, teach really complex skills and sort of have a little bit of breathing room. But like, honestly, I'm with you. I think most of the videos, 70%, 80%, I might even go up to 90%. I don't know. It depends on the day. Probably do need to be pretty short. They're in that TikTok range and are just like short and quippy and get to the point.
Yeah, I mean, and I know that's our community at Modern Classroom is definitely going to be so excited to hear that there's now a 30-minute max and not just a 5 minute. Because I know, again, with teachers who have a more complex content that they're sharing, they're like, oh my gosh, this 5 minutes is really, really tight. Like it's really, really tight. And so to hear that there's now an option, oh my gosh, that's exciting. That's really exciting. And Nef, I also really like what you pointed out with storytelling, right? Like being able to hook your audience is also pretty impactful. And this is something that I tell, again, my educators when they're creating videos is that you actually don't have to talk in a monotone voice. Like, and you don't have to be professional about it either, right? Like let your personality shine through. And I think my students definitely loved me goofing off in the videos. Like I'm not goofing off to the point where they're distracted with what they're learning, but they are able to see my personality shine through in the videos. And that hooks them. And that's really exciting stuff. So with teachers and, with educators who are just like trying to figure out how and what their persona is going to be in front of a camera. It's like, no, just be yourself. Have a good time. It's going to be such a good thing for your students to see you having a good time and being yourself.
Totally, totally. It's kind of like, I don't know if you ever heard this, but some teachers are like, in your first year, you don't smile before December. Like you come in and you are militant, right? And then folks are like, what are you talking about? Like you are who you are. And I think sometimes, not that we've been given that advice when we get in front of the camera, but we become these folks who are smiling, who are just sort of like Do you remember those Ben Stein Visine commercials? Am I dating
Yes.
myself here?
Yes, I do remember. So I guess I'm dating myself also.
Yeah. So for anybody listening who has seen those, that is what some folks are like. And I think, you know what, it's a natural response to being super nervous. And it's totally okay if the first couple of videos that you create sort of come out that way. And then hopefully as you get a little bit more comfortable, you get some feedback from your students. You're like, okay, this is who I am. The same person that I've shown you in front of the classroom every day is who I am when the camera comes on too, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And we expect our students to show up as themselves, right? And so we kind of want to model that as well. And I firmly believe that my relationships with my students are so good because I was just me. Like, I'm really goofy. I like to sing out loud sometimes. My singing voice is not cute. And I just celebrated with them all the time. And they just saw me for me. I was really silly and I was also playful, but I was also stern. Like, if you see Ms. D's face, like she's not smiling anymore, like you better get it together because she's about to go ham. But yeah, it's I remember that. I mean, I went to school for education and they were like, don't talk about your age, don't talk about your experience, and don't smile. And I'm just like, but I look goofy not smiling. So I'm going to smile regardless. I may not tell them my age because I don't know why, but like, sure, I won't tell them. But then it made sense to me because like I did my student teaching in the Netherlands. I was 21, 22, and I was teaching 19-year-olds. So I was like, oh, okay, I see. We're not going to talk about age. But it is really funny that like you just don't show them, like you gotta, what is it? What do they say all the time, Nef? It's like respect, right? Like it's kind of like getting students to respect you out of fear. And not necessarily because they want to. And I'm like, that's not how it functions. I don't want my students to fear me. That sounds awful.
Totally. Yeah. It's like very like Machiavellian in terms of sort of the way that some folks might approach it. But yeah, I think so. And I think when we want to build authentic relationships that are based off of sort of mutual respect and all of that, video becomes a really important way to do that. Like going back to the beginning of the podcast when you talked about that dance instructor who brought in their kids, who invited students into her home, that's huge, right? And at that point, students want to respect her. They want to do the work because of who she is and who she has shown herself to be, right? And you don't have to instill the fear of God or anything like that. It's just like, look, we are both here for this mutual goal and let's get it done together. And that is some of the best classrooms I've ever been a part of.
Yeah, and it also just shows that we're all human beings, right? We're not just a teacher, we're not just a student, but it really shows the different complex layers of who we are as human beings. And so I think that that's such a beautiful thing.
Totally. So before we wrap up our discussion, we've got a segment here where we ask every single one of our heroes to share some tips and advice for teachers. We've been talking about video a lot, but I want to sort of bring that down to, I'm going to make it hard for you. So your top 2 tips for teachers who are trying to create videos, just 2.
Just 2. Oh my goodness. Okay. So the first one is embrace your mistakes. Embrace your mistakes. Nobody is perfect. We as educators definitely don't have time and energy to be perfect. So embrace those mistakes. And I feel like our students have a lot more respect for us when they see us make mistakes. And so when I started making instructional videos, my first one took me all day because I wanted to revise and edit and make sure that I pronounced the words correctly and I didn't stumble on words or whatever. And I just kept revising. And that's not a good use of time. So just embrace your mistakes, embrace the interruptions that are happening, especially if you have dogs or kids at home, if you're recording at home, or if a student accidentally interrupts you while you're recording at school, embrace those interruptions and embrace those mistakes. I think, again, that shows us as human beings, it shows the real side of us, right? And we don't want to really strive for perfectionism. And so with that, your students see you making those mistakes, embracing those mistakes and interruptions and still keep going. I think that's a really important skill for our students to witness over and over again. Another thing that I would highly recommend is having a plan before you start recording a video. I think that recording a video should be your last thing on the list to worry about, right? Like, I would highly suggest creating those slides already, having those slides, having talking points in each slide, and really making sure that you know what you're going to talk about. Because again, if you don't have this like light script, like a bulleted point of keywords, you're going to have to go back and say like, oh, I didn't say this one thing, or oops, I forgot to mention this, right? And so really plan out your skill or the content that you're going to cover before you start recording your video. Your video, the way that, when you record, that's your last step. That is your last step. And I, again, made the mistake of focusing on recording the video as opposed to not plan. Like I planned it, but I was so focused on recording that everything else did come together like I wanted it to. And that's why it took me so long, was because it was like, oh, but I want it to look this way. I want it to look that way. I want to have this transition. I want to edit it and like have these animations or these annotations. And it's like, those are cool and all, but that's your last thing. Like have a plan before you start recording. So again, you're using your time wisely, because I wholeheartedly believe that teacher time is like super important.
For sure. It is a finite resource. You don't get more of it. It is so, so, so important. And I love those two tips of making sure that you plan and you embrace those mistakes. And theoretically, if we embrace those mistakes, it models vulnerability. Students feel really engaged and ready to create their own videos as well. So lots of reasons why you might want to leave that flub in or whatever it is. So really, really dig those two tips. Final question. What are some of your favorite online resources that you love to share with folks? And you cannot say the MCP plug.
What? I'm actually a huge fan of Learning for Justice, just because I feel like their articles are very relevant to today's worlds and the events happening all around us. And it does help educators navigate hard conversations and even hard topics that they could and should cover with their students, right? Especially what's happening in the world. Another one that I really like is Cult of Pedagogy by Jennifer Gonzalez, only because like she really does cover a lot of different things about education. One thing that I really appreciate about her is that there's this equity resource of the week. And again, like that's something that I like look forward to, just so I can click and be like, oh, this is something that I didn't even know, or this is something that I could start implementing in my everyday life, or this is some organization that I need to hype up or support or, whatever. And so it really does provide all of these resources that are just so important to me. And so Learning for Justice, Cult of Pedagogy, those are two online resources that I love to just share with educators as much as I can.
Dope. I have checked out Cult of Pedagogy, but I am not familiar with Learning for Justice. So I'm going to have to check that one out. And hopefully a few listeners join me in checking out that equity resource and everything that is there. So Toni Rose, thank you so much for joining EdTech Heroes. Listeners, you can follow her on Twitter. She is at Classroom Flex. Thank you so much for listening. I am Nef, and I'm looking forward to seeing y'all next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of EdTech Heroes, presented by Screencastify.